Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Elizabeth Denny. I'm the director of the Outsider Art Fair. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for attending OAF Talks and Performances. It's my pleasure to introduce a conversation about the exhibition, The Lost World, The Art of Minnie Evans. The exhibition is currently on view at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta and travels to the Whitney Museum of American Art here in New York this summer. There's an exhibition catalog published by Delmonico Books and the High Museum of Art, which I'm pleased to say we have available at the desk, should you wish to pick up a copy. Katherine Jentleson joins us today as the curator of The Lost World, The Art of Minnie Evans. She is the senior curator of American Art and the Mary and Dan Boone Curator of Folk and Self-Taught Art at the High Museum. Since joining the High in 2015, she has curated 10 exhibitions, including Really Free, The Radical Art of Nellie Mae Rowe, which toured the country from 2021 through 2025. Katie has grown the High's internationally renowned folk and self-taught art collection by more than 600 objects, including major acquisitions of work by Thornton Dial, Lonnie Holly, and the Gee's Bend Quilters. Dr. Jentleson, who received a PhD from Duke University, adapted her dissertation into a peer-reviewed book, Gatecrashers, The Rise of the Self-Taught Artist in America, and the High Museum of Art's 2021 exhibition of the same name. Thank you for being here, Katie. Barbara Haskell has been a curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art since 1975, recently celebrating 50 years at the museum. She is a recognized expert on early 20th century American art and author of over 30 publications. She has curated many landmark thematic exhibitions, retrospectives, and authored scholarly monographs on a range of early 20th century and post-war American artists. In 2003, she was the recipient of the Lawrence A. Fleischman Award for Scholarly Excellence in the Field of American Art History by the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, and was the 2024 recipient of the Frederick Church Award for Extraordinary Curatorial Contributions to American Art and Culture from the Olana Partnership. Thank you for joining us today, Barbara. María Elena Ortiz is a curator at the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth and joins us today as a contributor to the exhibition catalog. Previously, Ortiz was the curator of the Perez Art Museum in Miami, where she spearheaded the Caribbean Cultural Institute. Her writings have been published globally, a recipient of the Colección Patricia Phelps de Cisneros and Independent Curators International Travel Award for Central America and the Caribbean. Ortiz's curatorial practice is informed by the connections of Latinx, Latin American, and Black communities in the US and the Caribbean. We are so grateful to lead sponsor the Horseman Foundation. Oh, sorry. Thank you. We are so grateful to lead sponsor the Horseman Foundation and co-sponsor John Jarrett for supporting this talk. Thank you all again for being here.
All right. Thank you, Elizabeth. We're so excited to be here, and I'm very pleased that you could both join me. As you heard from those wonderful introductions, these are two incredibly esteemed curatorial colleagues, but they both have a special connection to this show. Barbara is going to be the curator presenting it at the Whitney, where it opens later this summer. And María Elena, as Elizabeth mentioned, contributed an amazing essay to the catalog for the exhibition. And we'll kind of come back to your entry point into Evans's world later in our discussion. But before we get started, I wanted to give an overview of Evans's art and life for those of you who are less familiar with her, and also give you a sense of kind of some of the central premises of our exhibition at the High. So Minnie Evans said her drawings of harmoniously intertwined human, botanical, and animal forms came from visions of the lost world, or nations destroyed by the great flood described in the book of Genesis. And after her grandmother Mary died in 1934, and the visions that she'd been experiencing since childhood became increasingly strong, Evans produced an incredibly large body of work, mostly on paper, in a range of abstract and representational styles. From infancy, she called the coastal city of Wilmington, North Carolina, home. And when she turned 56, she had this big change in her life because she shifted from decades working as a domestic laborer to collecting admissions at Airlie Gardens. And this is a major destination for plant enthusiasts that you can still visit today. It's famous for its azaleas, so right now is like the prime time to go visit it, just saying. So there she was, posted on the edge of one of the most beautifully landscaped gardens of the southeastern United States. And there she made art during idle moments, hanging it on or near the garden's striking wrought iron entrance gate. And I actually made an animation that didn't work in this PowerPoint. So I'll have to manually show you that the gate looks like that. That's the entrance to our exhibition. And just imagine it kind of melding with that incredible painting. Because I was trying to make the point that these kind of flowing, curving forms of the gate and so many other things that she encountered in the garden really impacted the aesthetics of her drawings. So in this way, because she was putting her work actually on the garden gate and also on the gatehouse, which you can see kind of there in the upper left of that photograph, she started to garner a reputation beyond Wilmington. And this led to a 1966 show here in New York at two churches on the Upper East Side, which took The Lost World of Minnie Evans as its name. And so in November, we opened our exhibition at the High, which includes more than 100 of her drawings and about a dozen of her rare paintings, presented in roughly chronological order, that unfurls her artistic development and offers a range of contexts for interpreting her art, from the extrasensory experiences of her visions to the double-edged realities of the extravagant estate where she labored in the Jim Crow South. And for our exhibition, I chose to revive this title, The Lost World, and this callback was meant not only to emphasize the artist's kind of own conviction that her drawings came from lost worlds, from these extinct realms, but also to introduce what our exhibition really does, which is to talk about her world, the kind of historical circumstances of her life, and how the major events that kind of impacted her and changed her really kind of unfold in her work as well. So I'm talking about things like the incredible surroundings of this coastal environment where she spent her entire life, which translates into these incredible sunsets and sunrises over the Atlantic Ocean. The way that World War II affected her drawing practice. She really ramped up her production during World War II, but that was a time when there was a real scarcity of materials. So she didn't have access to that many pigments in her Crayola boxes that she used for the next few decades. And then, of course, her experiences as a Black woman working on the Jones and later Walters estate. She was also a child when the Wilmington Massacre happened. It was a traumatic event for her. And so really understanding what that was like and the way that she was kind of always under a great degree of surveillance as a Black citizen in this city in the face of this major traumatic event was something that made me see her drawings really differently. And the way that that kind of surveillance reappears, I think, in a lot of different ways. But of course, there was the beauty of the garden that impacted her, not just the wonderful flowers and trees, but the actual built environment, the statuary. And this all led to her recognition in 1975 with this exhibition at the Whitney, for the year that Barbara started working there. So I'd love, Barbara, if you could talk a little bit about that exhibition and the kind of historical circumstances of it, how and why it happened. Yeah.
Is this on? Oh, good. So you're right. So you see the exhibition that was in the lobby gallery of the Whitney, and if you who remember the Breuer building, the Whitney being there. So the impetus for the show really began in 1968 in several reasons. There was a gallerist named Dorothea Silberman who began to had two shows of Evans' work in '68 and began to handle her work in the gallery. That was the same year that the Met mounted its show Harlem on My Mind, which you probably all remember. It unleashed a huge backlash among the Black community because it included no fine art. And there was an emergency coalition, a Black emergency coalition that was formed that began to approach museums with the idea of furthering the representation of Black artists. And the Whitney responded by agreeing to do a sequence of shows in our lobby gallery of Black artists, and to mount in 1971 a big survey show called Black Artists in America. So this was the context. In 1973, Dorothea Silverman came to the museum and with the idea of proposing a show of Minnie Evans to be part of this project of Black artists in the lobby gallery. The curator at the time, the Works on Paper curator, Elke Solomon, got very intrigued, began to plan a show. It was all scheduled. And then a new director came in later that year, in 1974, Tom Armstrong. And Elke Solomon left the museum. So the museum had a show that was on the schedule with no curator. And around that time, Nina Howell-Starr had written to Tom Armstrong about her own work. She wanted Tom to buy and show her work. But in the course of communicating with him, she mentioned that she had written a lot on Minnie Evans. So the show had no curator, and Tom Armstrong saw this woman who had done work on Minnie Evans, and so Nina Howell-Starr became the curator of the 1975 show. And you can see by the installation in the gallery, one, that was a very tiny space. The work was just installed with no wall labels, with no kind of descriptive content, no sense of really the development of the career. And that will change with the show that we're taking from the High Museum, which is one probably 4 times as big as the Lobby Gallery show. It will have a lot more material. We're doing a lot more education work in terms of wall labels, describing, as Katie said, not only Evans's biography in Wilmington, but also the gardens. There will be a whole case material devoted to photographs and postcards of the garden, sort of that inspiration. And then an entire case that looks at Minnie Evans' reception, beginning in with the 66 shows, these 2 small shows in New York that were 3 days apiece and had very few people attending. But then the magazine articles that began to feature her, and then the 1975 show will have not only installation photographs, but some of the reviews from that show. There was a little bit of pushback for that show, I should say, basically from one critic, Michelle Wallace, who was the daughter of Faith Ringgold, who really criticized the museum for promoting an artist, an outsider artist, as opposed to looking at professional Black artists, and promoting an artist that didn't directly deal with race issues. But on the whole, the show was very well received. And since that show, which kind of catapulted Evans into much more national attention, she's had an amazing amount of attention, which Katie will probably talk about. She's been in group shows, in innumerable places. And when we celebrate her now at the Whitney, we're really celebrating her as an artist. Not really even as an outsider artist, although all of you are here for that reason, but we're promoting her as an artist. We have enough space, and with the kind of show that is coming to us from the High, we're able to really show the development of somebody who is a major American artist, and that's how we're presenting her work. We'll differ a little bit from the High, only in that because of this focus on Evans as an artist, we're not celebrating Nina Howell-Starr as a kind of discoverer of Minnie Evans. We're acknowledging her connection to Evans and her kind of promotion of Evans that was so important, but we're doing it in the case where we look at a lot of the reception of Evans's work. So in that sense, our show is a little bit different from the High, and we'll treat Evans as really part of the history of American art, which is what the Whitney stands for.
Yeah, less label copy too, because you all do bilingual labels, which is wonderful. And also, I got in a lot of trouble with my colleagues at the High about the word count of labels for this show, because especially I think when you write a catalog essay for an exhibition, you just have so much research material you want to share. So again, it's open until April 19th at the High, so if you can make it to Atlanta and then come back and see it at the Whitney, that would be awesome. But to Barbara's point, Minnie Evans has just been shown in so many contexts, especially over the past 10 or so years. I kept seeing her work as I was kind of coming up in the field in these big major surveys of Southern 20th and 21st century art. And then in the past couple of years, there have been all of these inclusions of her in relation to art of surrealism and the fantastic. And that's how I met María Elena, because she included Minnie Evans in this incredible show that she did at her institution, the Modern Fort Worth, called Surrealism and Us, Caribbean and African Diasporic Artists Since 1940. And so María Elena, will you talk a little bit about that show and how you came to include Minnie Evans in it?
Yes, thank you. Such a great to be here. So I'll start with the thank you. So as some of you may know, I've done a lot of research on the Caribbean and Afro-diasporic art. And I was always interested in thinking about those practices historically. And that's when I started looking into surrealism, because there's a historical aspect. You know, surrealism of the modern avant-garde was not only the one that outspokenly spoke against white supremacy, and even though Bertram is a very complicated figure that we're not gonna talk about today, there was certain alliances that he made with artists of color and also different thinkers. One of those thinkers is the Césaires. So I met Césaire and his then wife, Suzanne Césaire. They were from Martinique, and they aligned themselves with surrealism when they were students in Paris. And then they returned to the Caribbean before the war, and there they start writing about surrealism and really thinking, especially Suzanne, about how surrealism is a way in which artists of color, people of color, can really use their imagination to escape reason and create a new world for themselves. Very much thinking, as long as there's oppression against people, there's always gonna be the surreal. There's always gonna be a way in which we can create a new world to really fight oppression. So when I started doing this research, of course, people like Lamb were very important and very iconic. So if you haven't seen the Lamb show at MoMA, please go see it. It ends on April 14th. And ironically, or not ironically, I mean, I knew about Minnie Evans' work, but then what I was most surprised was like that there are parallels to Lamb, in the sense that these are two artists with different training, different experiences, but they do aligned in how they had to negotiate their own world and how honing into the spiritual to portray and depict their own reality became a tool, which I would argue, of liberation, right? So, for example, here you see The Jungle, this beautiful work on paper, in which he's very much making a critique about Cuban realities in the 40s, which at the time, you know, was occupied by the Americans, no pun intended, right? No parallelisms for today. And he was looking at how him as a Black Chinese Caribbean subject, how his body was very much racialized, and how the sugarcane, because really what you're looking at is a sugarcane field, which is the space which, you know, a lot of enslaved people were working at, becomes a symbol within the Cuban iconography. And then he embeds in it different motifs, some of which some argue are actually sexual, like you see the buttocks, which some argue that has to do with like prostitution in the island, but also different mass and Afro-diasporic deities in terms of Afro-Caribbean religions. So I was very intrigued by how, you know, he's using the fantastic or this kind of surreal imagery to depict his world. And then you have another work on paper from 1943, which is here at Minnie Evans' Mosquito Bombs, in which she's painting the site that she recognized so much, which is the garden, but then she incorporates this almost flying insects that very much are reminiscent of Second World War airplanes. So she, as Katie was mentioning, you know, she comes from a space of a lot of struggle as a Black woman that experienced the only successful coup d'etat in this country with that massacre that happened, that when that happened, her family had to migrate, and she started having dreams, and she started very much honing into the spiritual side to process what was going on in such an oppressive system, similar to then Lam, in a Caribbean island, also processing his own dynamics. And ironic, or coincidentally, Evans does mention that she has Caribbean ancestry in her line from Trinidad. So that was also a really nice connection to the exhibition. And I was really much thinking about the modern avant-garde of the surreal, not as something that necessarily originated in Europe, but rather started in the Caribbean when you have a bunch of enslaved people that in a voodoo trance decide to take over their masters with the Haitian Revolution. And what happens if you think about that as the really origin of surrealism that then migrates to Europe in the form of fascism? Then all these refugees, because they were, Rothko and also other people that are coming into this country escaping the craziness, and then is reinterpreted here in the Caribbean and in the wider Black diaspora. So that was my project.
Yes, and if you haven't seen the Lamb Show, it's open still at MoMA, so try to make a plan to see that while you're here. Yeah, and I think that this work that you do, María Elena, in the essay, it's really situate Minnie Evans with all of these other kind of Caribbean counterparts is really powerful. And it brings me to Barbara. We've had conversations over the years about a lot of self-taught artists, and I think at the core of a lot of those conversations is this linkage that you've always seen to American modernists who are interested in spiritualist practices or accessing forms of higher consciousness. And Charles Birchfield was one of the artists who's kind of come up and then visually, clearly has an affinity with Minnie Evans. So will you talk a little bit about him?
So nature has always been, American painters since the 19th century have looked at nature as a site of the presence of God, the presence of some universal spirit. When you think of Emerson, the transparent eye, this idea of looking at nature and feeling the currents of the universe, the spirit running through him, he says, I feel part and parcel of God. So a lot of early American modernists felt the same. This was a tradition that carried from the 19th into the 20th century, and a lot of modernists, from Arthur Dove to O'Keeffe to the New Mexico Transcendentalists, were involved in translating the spiritual and seeing in nature some sort of sense of the presence of the spirit. And Birchfield is maybe the most aligned with Evans because of the kind of duality of his images of nature. So very early on in 1917, he created a kind of a dictionary for himself of symbols. And they were all very dark, morbidity, fear, terror. And these were motifs that appeared throughout his work. And they give a sense that within this ecstasy of nature, there's always a darker side that's kind of lurking. But I have some wonderful quotes of Birchfield, which I'd love to share because they are so like Minnie Evans that, so bear with me. The rare moments when time seems to stop and all seems a perfect peace between my creator and myself. Here in this humble spot in nature, eternal be the glimpse. I feel surrounded by God's presence. Only here could I be with God. The spirit coming through these trees is both me and my creator merged. And I think in a sense that was Minnie Evans, who really saw in nature the presence of God and felt that God watched over her and that this was a respite, a place of salvation, a place of redemption, that very similar to Charles Birchfield, that it was nature itself and a very American idea about nature, I think, that has really been part of our history since its beginning. Mm-hmm.
And this might be obvious by now, but I think part of why we're doing this work of comparison in a talk like this is part of what has plagued self-taught artists like Evans from ever being like truly part of the canon or truly part of a mainstream art history, is that they're always seen as separate from or just that what they were processing and the methodology that they were using and their approaches were somehow different than that of so many trained artists. But what I think the future is to say, actually, like as you've pointed out, there's this whole other origin story to surrealism, is that there are so many ways that artistic breakthroughs happen, right? And there are so many interesting alignments you can make between artists across spectrums of training, across national borders, And so that is part of the work that I think we're all interested in doing. And I know a lot of other people here in this room too, of just making self-taught artists have, lots of places where they can be seen and artists to whom they can relate. And so this is another comparison that you made in your catalog essay, María Elena, and it's on the kind of subject of beasts as kind of like hybrid, creolized forms. And so I was hoping you would say a little bit about what you see in terms of beasts.
Yes. I wanted to also kind of respond a little bit to what you mentioned, because I think that a lot of us are obsessed with linearity, and obsessed even in our daily lives, like I need to go this, and that. But life is way more horizontal and it has a lot of curveballs. So I think that part of like rethinking the way our histories are made is kind of pushing away from that fallacy of the linear and really thinking about the different aspects in our lives and our environments that are influencing how we're reacting to the world, which can create comparisons like this one. The fact, again, 1944, Minnie Evans, she probably never knew who Jacques Aigaron Georges was, a Haitian artist who also did not have a traditional university training, but like Evans, he used creolized figures, and by that I mean just mixing different motifs of Western, African, Caribbean heritage to then create new images. Because at the end of the day, all these artists are just trying to create new images of the world that they see. So, and what I found interesting as well is that when you think about, the Caribbean Carnival or notions of masking, some of the compositions that Evan is doing is very much that those forms, biomorphic forms that can feel like at times could be like even a costume in a carnival. And in the case of George, he's also thinking about, Haitian voodoo and how a lot of us, all of those loas syncretize with other Christian figures. So you can have Dambala representing both St. Patrick and as well as the loas Dambala. So that type of convergence is what I feel both of these artists are representing in both of these works from very specific perspective and points of view in different yet related parts of the world, the American South and the Caribbean.
And you mentioned that, Evans did talk a lot about this matriarchal ancestor that she had who was enslaved in Trinidad and trafficked to the US, porting in Charleston and then marching to North Carolina. And this was like a really important part of Minnie Evans' story that she told many people who asked her about her life. And so the kind of like creolized hybrid nature is also something about keeping these multiple identities, right? Which Evans, again, never went to Trinidad. We have a painting in the show that we think is based on an incredible temple that was completed there the year that she painted it. So she had this way of like traveling there through oral history and through adopting possibly like inspiration from masquerade and carnival and that sort of thing. But it was a way that she maintained this dual identity, right? One of several dual identities that I think she had. And then here's another comparison to another artist that you've worked on, Barbara Agnes Pelton, who also accessed higher consciousness. And,
right.
Yeah.
So Pelton is one of those artists linked with the New Mexico Transcendentalists who really was inspired by dreams and visions. She would jot down designs that she saw in her dreams and then created pictures out of them. But the work is all about channeling her sense of the spiritual and coming to a kind of salvation through transcendental connection with God and some universal spirit. So very similar to Minnie Evans, who also sort of channeled her dreams and waking dreams and sleeping dreams into work. Very similar. This is an early work that the Whitney has Evans's two first drawings that, as Katie mentioned, she made shortly after her very beloved grandmother died. And they were gift to us by Dorothea Silberman, the woman that initially came to the Whitney, as I said, in '73 with the idea of proposing a show of Minnie Evans. And when the show was scheduled, she then gifted the work to the museum, which is really great. We had an Agnes Pelton show, and we've showed a lot of artists that deal with spiritual kind of concerns. I think many of the early American modernists, in one way or the other, tapped into the idea of the spiritual, maybe not so much through theosophy, which was Agnes Pelton's way of connecting, but through this idea that there is a sublime, there's something beyond the material that gives us sustenance. So Evans, in that sense, really, as I said earlier, falls in a long tradition of American art that seems very American, very sustaining of something very almost national. The sense of the landscape as being such an important site of this idea of the universal.
And the more time that I've spent with all of the work that we have gotten to include in the show and the book, this work is the kind of, it's not just that she called it her very first, it's really the starting point for so much of the forms and compositional structures that she would go on to use in all of her later work. So when you do get to see the show, or if you do get to look at the book, just keep coming back to this piece because it becomes a kind of Rosetta Stone for everything that she goes on to do afterward. All of the kind of celestial bodies and rainbows and the line work, the little concentric circles that kind of explode later into eyes, which is kind of the last question I think I have for us before we open up to your questions. And it's on this idea of obliqueness, which is also something that you talk about, María Elena, in your catalog essay, and I talk a lot about in mine too, in a different way. But it's this idea that Evans, part of what's so powerful about her drawing is the way that it is confrontational, that it literally kind of locks you in with multiple sets of eyes, usually, in many of her works. But then the more time that I spent looking at the work, I also felt this tension of the sealed lips, right? That there's always this kind of pull, and then there's this push of a kind of ultimately like a lack of access to the full story. And she said all these great things in the oral histories that she gave to Nina Howell-Starr, the photographer who she befriended and who really documented her. She said things like, "I have more in my life than I can tell of. And, I can't tell you everything. I have to keep some things to myself." One of the epitaphs on her gravestone says something like, "For Minnie Evans, an artist whose art spoke that for which there are no words." So again, this kind of tension in between the pull and then the kind of block, right? Which brings us to this idea of obliqueness. And you had a wonderful way of thinking about it as a kind of agency.
Yeah, a lot of my thinking is very much inspired by Edouard Glissant's notions of opacity. And what I mean by that is that as we negotiate ourselves in the world, we have different roles, and we negotiate what we want to share with others and what we don't. And I think that in the case of Evans, I cannot imagine how it felt to be her in the 40s. She started making art later in her life. Just that notion of, I'm going to become an artist, like that freeing thought of what that means to her and her community, right? And the type of images that she wants to share in terms of how she's creating work. So I wasn't surprised, like reading those her comments of how she's always letting you know that there's more to her that she's keeping to herself, and that's okay. You don't need to kind of know it all, right? So I think that, there's something very powerful about being very self-aware, to me, it feels like, of who she was and the environment that she was living in and negotiating, and then knowing how she wanted to come up to people and so on. That makes sense.
And I think for me, there is something very unsettling about the work. You look at it and the eyes really, you're riveted, and that sense of the ambiguity that Katie is talking about. I think for me, and in a way very much like Charles Birchfield, there's this sense of, there's an underlying tension, but in the end, I think Evans had this sense that nature was a paradise, and she was painting, she was making images of a world that she didn't necessarily inhabit in the present, but felt very much that she would inhabit in the future. And this idea of the book of Revelations and the arrival of the second coming of Christ, that she would be redeemed, and that she was painting this world of a paradise that was beyond the present, but very much part of how she envisioned what her future would be. And I think that's what makes the work so compelling. It's this notion of the resplendent power of nature and the presence of some universal spirit in nature that really is makes this work very timely right now. I think it's exactly what we need.
That's true, but the garden for her is also her work. It's like labor, because she kind of grew up there, and that was most of her life, working in this garden that eventually
she didn't really
became.
work in the garden. She took admissions, so she could walk in the garden.
I think the garden had a lot of different resonances. I think we can agree on that, because it's like it was a place that also held a lot of these memories. Like, she lived on those grounds, right? In ways that she didn't share what that was actually like for her family, like living in this tiny cabin on this very large estate. And so, yeah, there was so many things that were intertwined, like memories, good, bad, labor,
And
rest.
even in
Yeah.
Christianity, like the garden is, yes, the Garden of Eden, but that's also where the original sin happened. So it's kind of this, twisted space.
And I think it embodies too, like, and this goes to Birchfield as well, like that nature is always this decomposing kind of entity, right? Like there's always that tension of the flourishing, but also the decay and the violence and also the gentleness of it. One thing I wanted to say, having this incredible collage in the center of the screen before us, another thing that the show really does is talk about her accounts of her visions, because she spoke about them a lot. There are a lot of records of her talking about what her visions felt like. And she gives varying descriptions, but she said things like, I'd walk out my door and everything was rainbow. And there would be faces coming out of the bushes and the trees. There would be pictures hung across the horizon. And so when she starts making these really incredible collage works in the late 60s, I feel like it's her ultimate expression of what the visions really were for her aesthetically, like how they played out. But then again, there's this question of like, how much did she also create the narrative of the visions to kind of surround and explain this incredible imagery that she was creating. So I think it's probably a good place to open up, unless there's a final thought that either of you have. Okay, so we'd be happy to take questions from the audience. You're the first person I saw. I don't know if there's going to be a microphone. I can give you mine, or.
Well, I'm kind of curious to know how much she felt that her work was ultimately religiously driven, and was an expression of her religion, or was it an expression of her culture independent of a religious view?
Well, Katie could answer that too, but she was very, the book of Revelations was something very dear to her. She read the Bible all the time, and the sense of this notion that paradise was inevitable, that God would triumph over evil, I think was something very dear to her. So that in a sense, the religion was part of, I think, who she was and how she approached the world, but she also was somebody who lived in the world and channeled a lot of things that she saw and other things that she experienced. So it wasn't just a one-dimensional idea that she put into her pictures, but religion was definitely part of it, a big part of it.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of the artists that I've self-taught artists that I've worked on have a kind of a religious background, a spiritual practice, and are very deferential to God. Certainly. Believe there is a God. But I think that a lot of them aren't in church, like on Sundays, and she was. I mean, she was like a big leader in her local AME, and she taught Sunday school, she sang in the choir, so she was, mm-hmm. And then a thing that the show kind of touches on too is that she certainly kept a lot of illustrated texts on the life of Christ, like Seventh-day Adventist texts, even though she wasn't Seventh-day Adventist. And so religious imagery, both just from like the narratives in the Bible and the New Testament, and then also the illustrated kind of more popular publications that she kept around were very much inspirations for a lot of her imagery. But again, her spirituality then exceeded like normal, or not normal, but conventional religious observance to be something that she experienced in a lot of different ways.
But just to say, we have a whole room in the Whitney installation that we sort of that we're calling very affectionately the God room, because it has a lot of images of Christ and angels, and these are images that were very much part of her. And I think one of the other things that Katie has mentioned is that the whole idea of becoming an artist, that in her community, that was a difficult leap. You know, to become an artist was something that nobody else was doing. And so she had the idea that God instructed her, and she had this 3-part conversion experience where she felt God's presence behind this wreath, and the third time she experienced it, God told her to draw or die. And so she had this sense that she was doing it for a higher purpose.
And her pastor was actually somebody who reinforced for her that it was okay what she was experiencing. Her husband was super nervous about the kinds of these episodes that she would have, her desire to make art, as you're saying, like within her community, it wasn't necessarily a common thing. And so, yeah, but it all reinforced each other. But she also like put a huge amount of weight in this experience she had with a fortune teller, you know? So she was somebody who was also interested in other kinds of spiritualist practices or ways of understanding the mystery of the universe that weren't just like Christ-driven.
So she crossed the boundaries.
Yeah.
Hello. I want to thank you because you guys, the three of you, are so eloquent about something that's very quite difficult to talk about in terms of Minnie Evans' work. It's elusive and quite esoteric, and you're very evocative in terms of speaking about her from the different perspectives. And it makes me, there's a few questions in my mind. I think obviously there's a movement towards the spiritual in art, again, opened up by a number of artists. So in some ways that's done. Not done, but I feel institutions are open. There's obviously a movement towards women in art, which is going strong and seems to be increasing. The difficulty that I've encountered is in relation perhaps to black art and educated artists and self-taught artists. And you alluded a little bit to it with the Haitian problem, I might call it, and surrealism and that relationship. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit, maybe in relation to her, and how, what your thoughts are on that dichotomy.
Well, you know, in my essay, I talk a little bit about that because when the show opened, as Barbara was mentioned, there was a big critique. And the critique was, in a lot of ways, from Black artists, saying, how is it that the Whitney is doing a show with an artist that, you know, quote unquote, is kind of untrained, yet there's a lot of trained artists around you that you're not showing. And to me, that is the problem, not necessarily the division, is that it's how to really create more expansive histories. That being said, another thing that in my research I found really interesting was that following Glissant's thought is that he speaks about the Black diaspora, its place of origin, not as Africa, but really the Atlantic. And we're always uprooted, so we don't really have like this precise origin, right? And once we are in the West, we're forced to assimilate. And assimilate might mean in this context, going to get an education as an artist, or staying closer to an origin by not doing and having a different type of life. And it doesn't matter if we assimilate or not, we're still not gonna have a show at the Whitney in the main galleries in 1975. So to me, an artist come in different forms. You can go through an MFA, you cannot, you can do a PhD, you cannot. I mean, for me, art is about communication in creating images that the eye cannot process and to express realities that we cannot process even verbally. So I don't care too much about that. I'm more interested in creating a space in which is more expansive and it really tells a wider history of the different art production and cultural production. So for me, the critique that Wallace did is a real one. Like, how come you're not, my mother is not, Faith Ringgold is not having a show at the Whitney when she's a fantastic artist. It's just, for me, disappointing that, or I hope they will move me on that tension of like self-taught, not self-taught, because I think they're all valuable.
But just to add a little bit to what you're saying, I think that since 1975, there's been an opening up of the canon, and at this point, Minnie Evans, we're presenting her as an artist. She's as much an artist as anyone else we would show at the galleries. So we're not demeaning her or putting her in a category of self-taught as a way to kind of put her in another category. We're really recognizing her achievement as a fine artist, whether she was trained or not. Her work stands up with that of Charles Birchfield and Agnes Pelton. And that, I think, has been an opening up that's happened in the last 50 years.
And I'll also say that I think there's often, reception history is always, it can never be represented only by like Michelle Wallace's critique, right? Because basically that a year later, Minnie Evans was included. Her first presentation at the High was in the 2 centuries of Black art that David C. Driscoll curated. And I'm sure many of you know who he is, but he was one of the most pioneering curators, historians, and practicing African-American artists of the 20th century. So there's no like treating, especially like Black artist communities as a monolith and saying, you know, she was rejected or is not really true, because there's always going to be a diversity of opinion like across any group of people, right, about what's going on. And then another thing that María Elena does beautifully in her essay, again, is like that you mentioned earlier, is just talk about how it wasn't just about training or lack of training, it was about what Minnie Evans was showing in her work, and this perception that she only depicted white people, that there weren't enough Black people in her pieces. And I think that when we look at it today, we see so much more ambiguity in terms of if these figures are even raced, like there's just so much going on. And again, now that we understand her more fully as a person who survived this horrific massacre, we know that there is so much of the political and so much about resilience and survival kind of embedded in these images. So a few more thoughts. Is there someone else? We'll come back to you if there's, I saw a question. Oh, yeah, I saw you over in the middle there. Yeah, you.
Thank you. I'm looking at it. I'm looking at an artwork,
sorry.
and
it's
it's amazing. It kind of reminds me of some of the things I saw, like some of the ayahuascan art, like how it's seriously spiritually based. And I think it's very important, especially in today's time, in the climate that we're living in, especially when we're trying to find the humanity in the world from our leadership today. So it speaks to that. I think in suffering, sometimes it draws, when you can't see things around you that give you a good, positive outlook. Sometimes it's going inside, dealing with the spiritualism of art. And I think that's what I get from her art. And I think that as time progresses, institutions will start to realize, like, wow, like, I mean, this is just as, I mean, and I love them, but Campbell's soup is not as impressive to me as that. Like, if the Campbell's soup looked like that, it'd be everywhere. So I think that, I don't know, I just appreciate it, that's all.
Thank you, Antonio. And I was pointing to you in the middle. Oh, it's okay. No, but thank you, Antonio. And I think we're totally in agreement in terms of what her art feels like today, too, especially like how it is a very kind of nourishing and I don't know, yeah, just a really, I don't want to say refreshing, because again, there's a lot of intensity to it, but it is very powerful today. I agree.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I had a question about the reception of her work and how that may or may not have affected her own production. Right, like when we think of visionary, there's this idea of turning inwards, but I think something that you guys have done so wonderfully today is shown how she's in dialogue with so much that's going on. And I was wondering if the very fact of the exhibitions of her work, if that has any inflection in her own output, in the sorts of work she was making, in how much she was making. Just the kind of dialectic between exhibition and production.
Well, Katie can speak to it probably more than I can, but in the 66 show, she came to New York several times and went to the Met, went to various museums, and there was something about the size of art, the kind of impact of art that she saw. So when she went back, she totally expanded the size of her pictures, and she began to oftentimes would use an image from an earlier picture, put it on the paper, and then expand around it in a way very similar actually to Charles Birchfield. So the links between those two artists are really uncanny. But she expanded the scale of her work so that the piece that we see right now from 66 in the middle of the screen, this was a piece that she made after her visit to New York, where she really was, and began to see, it was a time of her first exhibition in New York, even though very few people saw those two shows, but it still was, she was beginning to get recognition, and Newsweek and Ms. Magazine and various journals were beginning to feature her as an artist, and that undoubtedly led her to kind of maybe enlarge her ambition, to give her more courage to do these bigger pieces that, in a way, were more vulnerable. Working on a big scale is a scary thing, and she had the confidence because of her reception.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. And I'll say that, scrolling back here to the slide of a lot of her things, just to say that after she does have this experience in New York in 1966, yes, like to Barbara's point, she's expanding the scale of her work. She's starting to actually collage older pieces into these incredibly harmonious, complex compositions. But what you're seeing here is that she was doing always a lot of different things. Like she could do perspectival space. Like she could do these fully abstract drawings that people have compared to mandalas. But she, in her later work, like the two things that you see at the bottom of the screen, she starts to kind of combine those abilities, right? And so I think that the trip to New York and then the positive reinforcement that she gets through sales of her work in the 60s and 70s makes her more confident as an artist to kind of draw upon her own well, like she's, again, always coming back to those like forms of that first, my very first drawing. But in this later work, she's really kind of pulling from her repertoire and her ability to like show all different kinds of scenes and compositions. And even up until like her late years, when the work is not as strong, it's not as tight, but you still see again this like experimentation with her own kind of library or glossary of imagery, which I really love.
And when you think about these pieces like the one in the middle, this is high modernism. When you think of, it has the kind of energy and lyricism that Jackson Pollock has. I mean, she's in the canon. She's part of the story. And I think at this moment in time, we can really place her in that story and celebrate her, as I say, for being a fantastic American artist.
It was a question about when the show will open at the Whitney, and then also, Josh, are you asking, like, there was the interest in the 70s, and then, yep. And then, yeah, and then, okay, so yeah, just like the kind of ebb and flow of her popularity post like 1975. So we'll be very excited to share the exact dates of the Whitney's opening very soon. But for now, we can just say that it's this summer. So yeah, just keep your eyes and ears open for that. And then to the reception history, I mean, you know, it's just kind of like the normal thing that you see with so many artists. Her last big monographic show was in the 90s, and it was organized by a curator based in North Carolina. It didn't really make it much out of the South, except that it came to the Folk Art Museum. It came to the High in the South. Yeah, and I think it wasn't like she dropped off the face of the earth by any means in any decade. But what I was showing with those slides I showed from other exhibitions in like the teens of the 2000s is that there's been this resurgence, which goes back to a lot of what we've been saying, that just we're in a period of opening and changing and trying to correct blind spots. And she's just kind of keeps popping up, whether it's like shows that are trying to really expand upon our notion of Southern art, or shows expanding on our notion of surrealism from a feminist perspective, or, you know, all these things. And so that's new. Like, that's where we are now, and that's very different than the 70s, 80s, or 90s, is that she's, again, being incorporated into these other nonlinear kinds of new histories of art. Yeah, I just feel bad because there's other people who keep raising their hands. Okay.
You're talking about her as, in light of the African diaspora and other things. Can you talk about her in terms of her as a female artist?
Sure. Yeah.
What's the question?
I mean, you were just asking, you were commenting, a lot of the commentary has been about her place in a pantheon of African-American artists and so on. And you just mentioned the feminist, and I wanted to hear your commentary with regard to her as a female artist, not withstanding the African-American aspect. Because her work seems to me to have qualities that a female artist might have that maybe a male artist would approach differently.
I don't see that, actually.
Yeah.
Delicateness of some of her work, at least what I'm seeing here, and there's a use of color that maybe would be different.
Well, when you think about Charles Burchill, say, that's the closest. They're very similar in terms of color and in terms of even some of the forms. That if you go back to that image, Katie, the Birchfield. I mean, this is on the right. This is, you know, sort of very similar in the sense of the exaltation of nature.
Do you want to do one more? Sure. I thought I saw a red.
Yeah, one last question, right?
Yes.
It seems like a lot of her work uses like vertical symmetry to, I don't know, and it makes me think of the fact that the like additional labor of having to draw the same thing twice mirroring itself, and it also like means that you kind of see faces in it the same way that she described seeing faces in her work. And I was curious what you thought about the significance of the symmetry and the reflection of the image across the middle.
I'll say that I think the way that, like, if we're looking at this image of a painting at the center of this slide, the way that she plays with asymmetries within the larger sensibility of symmetry is part of what I love about looking at her work, especially like as it gets more complex, is that she's rigorous about this like overall balance, but then within it is kind of riffing and creating a lot of variation, which I appreciate.
And I'll say, you know, with the color is very seductive, but then I also find it quite playful because there's almost an appearance of symmetry, because when you look closely, maybe a plant that you see on one side is not the same one on the other side. So there's a lot of whimsical aspect. And I also feel like, you know, thinking about how she thought about her work as coming through from, you know, as a spiritual process, like I think there's something very meditative about just kind of like the labor intensive of how she constructs the image.
Hey, I think we might be over time. Yeah, so, okay, thank you all so much for coming. And